Hi everyone, and welcome to this second meeting of third space professionals who are misfit somewhere between academia and professional service staff at Australian tertiary institutions in particular. I'm Joel Nothman. I work at the Sydney Informatics Hub. Now, today we're going to hear briefly from three speakers in the first half of this meeting, while the second half will be spent in discussion amongst us. So this is an opportunity to meet each other and to get to understand how we see ourselves in this space and how we operate. For the discussion, you will be asked to choose one of three breakout rooms, one discussing the identity of the third space, another on how we engage with academics, and the third discussing how we build and manage successful teams in this space. Associate Professor Celia Whitchurch is based at the University College London Institute, and she researches changing workforce patterns in higher education. Together with the University of Melbourne's Professor William Locke and others, and we'll hear from Professor Locke a bit later, she's written seminal studies describing new roles in research institutions and their outlook in the institutional framework. We're unfortunately not able to have Celia present live, but we'll screen a talk recorded for us earlier in the week. And we'll have the honour of her company despite the time differences later in today's meeting. We'd like to see Celia's presentation now. Welcome everyone.
Next slide. Okay, what I've done in the first instance was look back at the webinar that took place on the 28th of May that was organised by the University of Melbourne called Issues from Third Space, the Depth. And it seemed to me that a number of key issues and problems arose from that. And this kind of provides a checklist for you, I think, as you begin your discussions later on. And it was very obvious that the key issues were to do with identity and the place of individuals, both in their own teams and sections, but also in their institutions and more widely in the research support community. And this is very obvious in the way people were talking about formal aspects such as their contracts, career paths and authorship of publications. But it also came out in the way they were related to colleagues day to day and the expectations upon them in their working lives. So I thought that fitted in very well with the kind of work I've done previously with other groups. Other issues included, I'm sure they'll be familiar to you, sort of the application of knowledge, the diversification of skill sets and the way this might be recognised and used. The way the careers of people in your community might develop, not only as a workforce generally, but individually and within your own institutions. And associated with this were ways in which capability could be built both individually and collectively within teams, and how this could be sustained for the future, linking in with your own professional development. Another issue that came out very strongly was recognition of the value of the work and the impact it might have. Sometimes people felt it was difficult to display impact, particularly, especially when disciplinary knowledge was being transformed in the adaptation and repurposing of research that had taken place. This wasn't always accepted or recognised by academic colleagues. And another sort of a key theme that came out, which was a very delicate balance, was the issue of breaking down individual disciplinary silos, creating a sense of collectivity among people working on particular issues across disciplines and creating synergy between them. And what one person called sociality of work, I'm not sure if sociality is a real word, but that sort of conveyed to me what individuals were trying to do. And it reminded me of what I think of as the Google approach to working life, although I never worked at Google, but the idea of much flatter structures, in fact, doing away with structures altogether. But how do you relate that to the obvious structures in universities of departments, schools, faculties, and disciplines. And I don't know if any of you have read Professor Rob Barnett's work, but he talks about the ecology of higher education. And it seemed to me that what individuals were talking about was a kind of ecosystem which is more fluid and organic than traditional models of structures in universities, which tend to be hierarchical, departmental. So how to manage much flatter structures, much more fluid structures, came out as something very much to think about. If we move on to the next slide, please. Okay, so what I've tried to do is put this in diagrammatic form. It's a kind of exemplar, and you'll be able to create your own diagrams, either later on or when you go back to your own institutions. And this kind of diagram came out of work I did a long time ago with the UK Leadership Foundation. And I was working with people in what I call in-between kind of project roles. For instance, widening participation, what was then called online learning, public engagement and research support. And what I've done is kind of redraw it for the constituency that I think you represent. And the key points are that these people were very much working in mixed teams on pan-university projects rather than on individual kind of functional or disciplinary areas. And what it seemed to me, again, from your earlier seminar, was that what you were doing tended to be split into what I call service functions. And maybe these people are more likely to be on professional contracts. I don't know, you can tell me that. And R&D functions, which perhaps might be more likely to be on academic contracts, but I don't actually know that. But that fits in very well with the early work I did, looking at the relationship between professional and academic staff. Again, the functions on either side of the arrows I've kind of guessed at, and again, as I said, you'll be able to draw your own diagrams, which will be much more specific for your particular situation at home, at your home institution. But it's a way into thinking about the issues that are coming up and trying to get beyond structures, I think is what I'd like you to try and do, though this is very difficult. Okay, next slide, please. Right, so introducing the idea of third space, which is very much a concept from social theory. Now, I realise you're all hard scientists. You may not think that social theory will be of much help to you, but I found this a very interesting way into looking, in particular, at groups that are not represented in formal documents. And what third space does is look at relationships between structures, between people, between activities, rather than looking at structural or looking at what's happened in the past and building on precedents. And as I said, it's particularly useful for looking at underrepresented groups. And in social theory, in fact, underrepresented groups are very, very much to the fore in the work that's been done. And so how I like to describe it is it allows for new voices and perspectives to come through that may not be in the mainstream, making the invisible visible and the implicit explicit, trying to shed a new lens on activities that don't appear in formal documents. And I found that was really, well, very helpful and very successful, in fact, in looking at the kind of work and the kind of individuals, the kind of roles, the kind of careers that people were pursuing in these kinds of in-between areas. So I thought it might be helpful to you in identifying different segments of your community and focusing activity, perhaps more importantly, finding ways forward, persuading other people that you're not invisible, you're in fact a key aspect of the research endeavour. So it's really just a way of thinking, way of looking, way of seeing the world in a different way. And it can be applied to organisations, teams, and even individuals. So it's really a new approach and a way of looking at roles that are not necessarily described in formal job descriptions. I think it's very interesting looking at job descriptions because they very rarely, in my experience, represent what people do. Okay, next slide, please. So, as I said, it's a way of moving beyond what's written down and looking at the way roles are constructed. What's actually going on outside specific job descriptions or even specific expectations, because individuals are very much in the driving space here. So what I did was develop 4 kind of what I call lenses for looking at what was going on. And these were spaces, knowledges, relationships, and legitimacies. And looking back at the list that I compiled from the first seminar that you had, it seemed to me that these were very appropriate and bring out the kind of uniqueness of what people were doing, as opposed to kind of generic statements that you find in informal documents. So knowledges in particular, looking at new kinds of what we call mode 2 or applied knowledge, not necessarily within a discipline, but across disciplines. Relationships are becoming increasingly important, particularly in our networked world. And at the moment, for people to develop new ideas, to have discussions, to actually develop new knowledge. So all these lenses are connected. And perhaps most difficult of all is establishing recognition or legitimacy or authority for what people are doing for the individuals themselves, and linking that to the kinds of rewards and incentives that can be offered, financial and otherwise. Okay, next slide, please. So just another couple of slides. I'm trying now to relate this back to what you might discuss today, relate the theory back to the practice. And one key item that came up was this interface between service or support and research and development, and how you manage, how much these actually cross over, and how you manage that kind of mixed space. And one thing that came up time and again when I've talked to other groups is whether you put all third space people together in one team, or whether you split them between specialist teams. And I think that's a really critical point that you will want to think about, particularly in your discussions today. Another important issue is how you manage these kind of plural environments without creating new structures and silos and specialties that people don't feel comfortable moving between. So again, it's an extremely delicate balance managing all this. A link to this is the relationship with the mainstream, with your institution, the departments, the faculties and the schools that you work with. And as I say, normally there's a hierarchy. You know, you have project leaders, then you'll have heads of department, you have deans, and then you'll have the senior management team. And some institutions have managed to develop a kind of hub and spoke arrangement so that there are many links, links are not just funneled through one channel. You have numerous links from the centre out to the periphery. And that can work better for knowledge exchange and for developing new ideas, but it's hard to manage. And some people, might find that difficult, but, I think creating synergy, developing and managing it is difficult, and that's what we're grappling with. And the other point that kept coming up with previous groups I've talked to is how the onus is on individuals to manage all this. You can't expect the senior managers always to know what's going on at ground level. So individuals need to be able to demonstrate the added value that they bring, bottom up. A lot of this is bottom up, and demonstrating its value. And I heard a lot about complex problem solving, for instance. I'm not a scientist, so I don't understand your world, but it seemed to me that being able to make this into a critical element in the research endeavour that doesn't necessarily depend on academics within their disciplines. It's an important piece of PR that you need to be able to develop. And the other point is understanding your client base, if you like. I don't like the word customer, but who needs the knowledge you're creating, and in what form do they need it? So being able to create bespoke knowledge for individuals, again, is critical, and making others aware that that's what you're doing. Okay, final slide, please. So moving on to relationships and legitimacies, and the two, it seems to me, are very closely connected. I really like this quote that that was an interview I did with a learning technologist many years ago, actually, and he said if you get the relationships right, everything else falls into place. And I thought that was just so true of working life, particularly these days. Many of the people I interviewed said, well, I don't see myself giving a service, I see myself as a partner with my academic colleagues. And I think that's a concept that may be very useful to you in the work that you do. This general flattening of organisational hierarchies and relationships was another issue that came up time and again. And the fact that younger and more junior staff might well be leading a team in an area that they had strong expertise in. And they might be even, for instance, showing a professor how to put their material online. I mean, that's a very simple example. You will have many more. Developing informal as well as formal relationships. I've mentioned that, the importance of networks, establishing your own authority. And one issue that came up in the last webinar was being able to negotiate with external agencies and showing that you can be successful in doing this. Generally developing your own professional capital, and by publicising what you're doing, new forms of knowledge, creating legitimacy and recognition for what you're doing. In other words, being a champion for the kind of work you do. That's actually the end. We do have a list of questions which are on the next slide. And in this, I was just trying to show how you might use the different lenses when you're working with the different questions. But you may have other ideas. But this was just really to help you into the discussion. So I hope that's helpful, and I look forward to talking more about what you do and how third space might help you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks, Celia. I think Celia might now have come online, though that was recorded. Thank you, Celia Whitechurch, for bringing an external and studied view of our space. I think that's interesting to see it from that perspective. And several ideas in there resonated with me, from ideas of how we create new institutional knowledge and new relationships within those institutions, to questions about how to segment and define this space. We'll have more of an opportunity to talk with Celia later. A key collaborator of hers in this study is Professor William Locke. He directs the Centre for the Study of Higher Education at the University of Melbourne. He publishes on such topics as the changing academic profession and the governance of educational institutions. With Celia, he's dedicated himself to teaching higher education professionals, which we all hope is a pathway for turning these insights into policy impact. So let's give it over to Professor Locke.
Thank you very much, Joel, and thanks to colleagues for inviting me, and indeed Celia, and it's nice to share a platform with Celia again, although it's of course two different hemispheres. I don't think that we've done that before, Celia. I'd like to talk about three things, if I may, which relate in many ways to what Celia has just talked about, but also provide different perspectives on some of the questions that she raised. First, I'd like to talk about myself, my career, and my current role, not because I'm an egotist or for the purposes of self-aggrandizement, but as another example of someone who may or may not be located in the third space. Then I want to share some data about professional staff in Australian universities as a way of starting to build an evidence base that can inform policy and practice in and around this space. And then finally, I'll speculate about the impact that the pandemic-induced retrenchment in Australian universities might have on professional staff, and particularly on the third space we're talking about. When people talk about the third space, they tend to be referring to professional staff with particular roles and responsibilities that bring them close to academic work or even cause them to cross over the boundary. But through my earlier work on the academic profession, and now with Celia on what I slightly reluctantly call the higher education workforce, I would suggest that some of those in academic roles and on academic contracts also occupy this third space too, and maybe increasingly occupy this space. This is actually only my second job as a teaching and research academic, I've also been what was called an academic related contract, I think it was called, which was fixed term and research only, although my job title was initially senior policy analyst and then deputy director of the research centre. But I've also worked for a total of 10 years in UK national policy bodies as a policy advisor and latterly as head of learning and teaching policy. And those were in between my university roles. I went from one and back to university and then on again to a national policy body and then back to a university. So while I've published over nearly 2 decades, I was actually awarded my PhD from University College London, where Celia is, and I was 3 years ago, and that was by publication. So I've not had a conventional linear academic career, but then as our research has also revealed, nor do many academics in universities nowadays, particularly at least among the younger generation. Let me tell you about my current position. Melbourne's Centre for Study of Higher Education is a research and development centre. It does 3 things. It does research into higher education in 5 particular areas. It carries out professional development for all academic and some professional staff, and it tries to influence policy and practice. And it also houses the L.H. Martin Institute for Leadership and Management in Tertiary and Higher Education, as you may well have heard about that. It's located in the Melbourne Graduate School of Education, and that's important because we are an academic unit. And as I say, we undertake research, we supervise doctoral students, we teach in the form of professional development, but also we have the L.H. Martin Institute Masters and Graduate Certificate programs, and we engage with others in order to influence policy and practice. But the centre is largely funded by the University Chancellery for our professional development work. And we work with all 10 schools and faculties in the university. So occasionally people in the university mistake us for a central service. We do work alongside learning environments, which is part of scholarly services, and which also includes library services. And we actually are housed in the same building as learning environments. But we're an academic outfit, as I say, and what sets us apart from a service is that we do research, and all the practice that we do is based on research, either our own research or others that we take from the research literature or from colleagues in our research communities. So I reckon we occupy the 3rd space for at least some of the time and for some of what we do. I certainly do, given that I think one of the things the university wanted when they recruited me was to raise the profile of the centre in policy circles and in the university nationally and internationally. And through the research that Celia and I have done and been doing, we're finding a significant number of academics who are negotiating their careers in creative ways, for example, to incorporate public engagement work, to focus on student employability, or participate in environmental sustainability projects. In other words, they're following interests and passions which are not necessarily mainstream academic activities, but they sustain them, and which sometimes they can build on and use to progress their careers and gain academic recognition and even promotion with. So maybe they are also creating this 3rd space, but from the other side of this ever blurring boundary. At this point, I'd like to share some evidence about professional staff in Australian universities. It's often assumed that as the overall number of staff in Australian universities has grown, that the proportion of professional staff as a percentage of all staff has also increased. And that is indeed the case in many countries, including the UK. But it's not the case in Australia. According to the Federal Department of Education, between 1997 and 2017, universities' overall workforce grew by around 50%, if you only count full-time and part-time staff, and close to 60% if you include casual staff. However, the proportion of universities' overall workforce, measured by full-time equivalents, made up by professional staff remained remarkably stable during this period, during the entire period, in fact, at close to 55% if you include casual staff and around 57% if you exclude them. What's actually more interesting is the changing makeup of these professional staff, and in particular, the levels of seniority. Now I'm going to share my screen, and hopefully this will work. I cannot share my screen while the other participant is sharing. Thank you. Great. So we can move on. There we go, great. So please excuse the size and the lack of clarity on these graphs on the slide. I probably wouldn't use them in a face-to-face room, but I'm hoping that on your computer or device you can crane your neck in and see it a bit closer up. Anyway, they come from an upcoming paper from a couple of colleagues of mine in my school, and they show the increases in professionals at Hugh levels 5 to 10 and senior executive levels between 1997 and 2017, and the decline in Hugh levels 1 to 4 in 3 different types of university. And the authors have used the year 1997 as the baseline of 100. So the senior executive category is combined with the Hugh 10 category to comprise the ranks of senior management staff. In the top left graph, Hugh levels 8 and 9 are grouped together to make up the layer of middle management. In the top right graph, Hugh levels 5 to 7 constitute the wide range of degree qualified regular professionals working below the management level in a variety of administrative and technical roles in the bottom left graph. And finally, Hugh levels 1 to 4 comprise those staff working in administrative and technical support roles or support staff in the bottom right graph. My colleagues have used a tripart system, tripart typology, if you like, to distinguish between the group of 8 most research-intensive universities in Australia, the leading research universities, as they call them, or LRU, all of which were established before 1960, and many of which are very large in terms of staffing. And they're represented by the dotted line, or lines. Those in universities established after 1960, up before 1980, post-1960 universities, which is the solid line, and those relatively younger universities established after 1980, post-1980 universities, or the line made up of dashes. And as you know, in Australia generally, the age of a university is a good predictor of its institutional prestige and research intensity. But clearly, the changes have not really differed much between the 3 types of university. There have been fairly steep rises in senior and middle management professionals, a rise but at a lower trajectory among regular professionals, and a fairly dramatic drop among support staff. A separate study by some fellows of my centre, which is published on our website, has looked at the distribution of professional staff by classification level at a large Australian metropolitan university. And this is between 1999 and up to 2017. I should mention that this large metropolitan university is not the University of Melbourne. Their period is a couple of years shorter than the study of my previous slide, but it does show in finer grain the same kind of story, I think. So in this institution, Hugh levels 1 to 5 have reduced as a proportion of the total over the period, whereas Hugh levels 6 to 10 have all increased, except perhaps for Hugh 8 between 2014 and 2017. Now, there are a range of factors that might come into play here. For example, the impact of new digital technologies, international student demand and the imperatives of revenue generation. All of these have resulted in an increase in the number of jobs requiring high levels of skill and attracting increased remuneration. And in recent years, there has been an increasing fluidity of responsibilities, with professional staff employed to undertake management, coordination and delivery in education, academic and research-orientated roles. And this includes the emergence of a range of new, highly skilled professional staff roles specific to education, such as curriculum and digital learning developers, and specific to research, such as data management, analysis and communications, which require a blend of technical and academic skills. In other words, what is generally referred to as third space roles. Many staff in Australian universities, including professional staff, have benefited from the growth in student numbers and revenue of Australian universities over recent years, both financially and professionally. But employment has become more precarious, as suggested in this chart, showing professional staff employment in Australian higher education institutions between 2001 and 2019, although the full data is only available up to 2018. So the bars in the chart represent student load in EFTSL, with domestic students in yellow and international students in blue. And the lines on the graph represent professional staff by full-time equivalents. The yellow line is permanent staff, the red line is staff on fixed-term contracts, and the blue line represents casual staff. And there are many reasons for this increase in staff numbers and precarious employment. so including staff providing support and services associated with increases in student enrolments, strategies to enhance workforce flexibility, which could account for the use of fixed-term contracts, and some staff employed on relatively short-term research funding. So we've seen a growth in professional staff at senior levels, but we've also seen an increase in the precariousness of some professional employees. Now, I haven't got time to delve any further into this, and in any case, that will require further data to be gathered and more institutional case studies, I think, to really understand what's going on. Perhaps this is something this network could look into, gathering evidence about the shape and features of the space, building case studies, revealing trends as we move, hopefully, into a post-COVID era. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. Don't seem to be able to do that. Or maybe I'll just leave it up. Sorry about this. Oh, there are references as well. Here we go.
I think that's worked now, William. You're showing and your slide pack has disappeared.
Oh,
oh and your screen sharing again.
Sorry. Not sure why this is happening. Is that better? Good. Okay. So finally, I'd like to speculate briefly about the impact that the pandemic-induced retrenchment in Australian universities might have on professional staff, and in particular on third space that we're talking about. So we're obviously witnessing a rare period of contraction for the system as a whole. Individual institutions have downsized before, but of course this is now a sector-wide phenomenon. And I think it's one that will last for several years as higher education reshapes and resizes itself to accommodate a permanent reduction in international students on our campuses and huge shifts in the way that we carry out research and teaching. So there's a lot of change management going on as we speak. And despite the increased workforce flexibility, such initiatives are frequently accompanied by rounds of voluntary and involuntary redundancies for both academic and professional staff. However, given that the conditions in the enterprise agreements for the redundancy for academic staff are considerably greater than for professional staff, it is indeed possible that considerably more professional staff than academic staff will be forced to leave the higher education system in the next year or so. And this may affect some categories of professional staff more than others, those on fixed term and casual contracts perhaps, at least initially. So this could drive a wedge between academic and professional staff, actually reinforcing the binary divide that has been blurring in recent years, but which could come to be redefined and reinforced in the midst of adversity. Or some senior managements in universities might actually take a more sophisticated approach to reconfiguring their workforces and recognize the importance of retaining high-level knowledge and expertise, both academic and professional, which will be key to future success and which will be extremely difficult to rebuild if lost. So we might ask of our senior colleagues in our universities, are you looking for short-term fixes to balance the books this year and next? Or are you actually thinking about longer-term strategies that retain and develop the specialist expertise that we will need as we change the way we conduct our core activities? Do you understand what skills and expertise exist in the university and what can be grown and developed to ensure the retention of staff with skill sets that are aligned with the university's changing needs and what further is needed to achieve the strategic goals in the university? Is this an opportunity to actually raise the profile of university administration as professional career path and actively plan and support the development of professional expertise in the university? And if it is an opportunity to do so, will this require a different reward structure for third space professionals with appropriate remuneration levels? And if online study and more flexible and home-based work arrangements become the norm, and these lead to lower operating costs as a result of fewer building works, less infrastructure being required, could some of these savings be invested in longer-term staff retention and development? So these are some thoughts on where we are now, how we've got here, and what the future might hold. And I hope they might help to provide a springboard for further discussion and potential activity in the network. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Locke. Thanks for selecting some, I think, insightful topics of discussion that might become the basis of future meetings. And I'm sure we look forward to further discussing these questions of identity with you and Celia in the breakout session soon. I was interested in the idea of crossing over the boundary, and that being unusual in academia is not so unusual at all. For bringing it home with data, thank you. And this idea of seeing threat or opportunity in the reconfiguration of under the current financial pressure. So lots to discuss there over the future. We're now going to hop over to Keith Russell. So far we've looked more at the angle of policy and governance, and now we're hearing from Keith who works at the Australian Research Data Consortium, which has become a focal point for community development, networking and advocacy in the Australian research data community. So Keith works with diverse organisations to develop policies and infrastructure that improve the management of research data so that researchers and others can benefit from a data-intensive future. Let's hear it from Keith. Can you steal the screen now? Wonderful.
You're muted, Keith.
There we are. You should be able to hear me now. Thank you. Okay, so thank you for those were two wonderful and really insightful presentations. I'm sorry I don't have that much to offer. My perspective will be more on where is the Australian Research Data Commons at present, give a brief introduction and provide you with a bit of perspective around what we are doing in supporting a number of communities. So I hope it will be helpful, at least in some of the presentations and the conversations, but my perspective is definitely from a slightly different angle. So yes, my name is Keith Russell, Manager of Engagements at the Australian Research Data Commons, and I will give you a brief, if I can, yes, there we are. Just a brief introduction for those that don't know the ARDC. We are an NCRIS facility funded under the NCRIS program. So this is a large national investment funded by the Australian Commonwealth, which funds all sorts of research infrastructure to support researchers to deliver pieces of infrastructure that don't run at an institutional level, but actually need national level investment and support. Some of these are discipline specific. The Australian Research Data Commons is a facility that is there for all disciplines and across all disciplines. So in the roadmap for the NCRIS back in 2016, there was a perspective that it was important to have a number of investments in digital data and e-research, and some of the existing investments like ANS, Nectar and RDS were actually brought together, and that resulted in this, this new initiative. So what is the purpose of the Australian Research Data Commons? Well, we're there to provide researchers with a competitive advantage through data. Now, we are only a small organisation, and if you view that in the whole national landscape, we can't reach out to all researchers, we can't provide all of the infrastructure and all of the skills and all of the support for researchers to actually have that competitive advantage. So what we do in practice is we partner with research organisations, so universities, MRIs, CRCs, a whole range of different organisations, and also research infrastructure organisations around Australia to achieve the goals that we want to achieve. So that requires work in a number of areas, and we've broken down our work into a number of strategic themes. Now, I'll skip coordination and coherence for now, and I'll come back to that in a second. So one of the things that we identified as key in achieving that change, in making sure that researchers have that landscape available for them to prepare them for that data-intensive future, is to have people and policy in place. And this, I think, is where our work especially lines up with the work that you're doing too. So it is crucial to have a workforce there, a group of people there that actually understand the researchers' need, but also understand the technology that's required to make this happen. And so in that regard, we're working on what are the people that are out there in the country and what do they need to have in place. We're also looking at policy that's required, both also at the national level, but also translation into a local policy to ensure that data is properly recognized, shared, reused, but also tools and platforms and software, etc., are available and recognized and reused, etc. So those people and policy are there, and they support a number of specific areas. So 3 of those specific areas are data and services. So making sure that the data can be properly created, managed, shared, and that there are services over that data to make that data available in sensible ways. That there are research platforms out there that researchers can collaborate on and do their analysis on. That software is created in a sensible manner, in an effective manner, and available so that researchers can actually use and reuse their software and do their analysis. And finally, we're doing work on compute in the form of, for example, Nectar Cloud, but also other cloud solutions, and storage together with partners, again, providing the research storage for research data for researchers around Australia. So I promised to come back to coordination and coherence. As I mentioned in the slide before this, we can't do this all on our own. We operate at a national level, and it's much more the work we can do reaching out to researchers is through local organizations and through infrastructure organizations that are already in place. So a lot of the work we do is in the form of coordination and coherence, and bringing together like-minded people that are experiencing the same challenges or experiencing seeing the same opportunities, to see if there are opportunities to align and to create an aligned and coherent package of services that are available to researchers. One of those pieces of work that we do in that regard is we facilitate a number of communities of practice. So if you follow that link, you'll find at present we have about 13 communities of practice that we are running, often together with other partners, and they're wide-ranging. Some of them are focused on a specific technology challenge or technology solution, like, for example, discussion on research containers or orchestration service. But some of them are more focused on a role, like around data librarians and what are common challenges and issues and opportunities for data librarians. And there are also groups that are focused on a specific topic and a specific angle, like the Research Software Management, Curation and Citation Group. So when we look at these communities, there are a number of things that we try to sort of keep as common principles when identifying which community should we support and how do we best do that. First of all, from our perspective, of course, it needs to support the aims we're trying to achieve in a broader sense. And what we do try to do is see if we can identify a direction or a specific challenge that the community can address. So that can be specific standards that need agreeing, specific approaches that would be valuable in agreeing on, but also just sometimes there's just enough value in sharing approaches and preventing duplication of effort. We don't try to do this on our own, but we'll try to identify the relevant partners which are also interested in this space and work together with them on this. Very important one, if it doesn't, or if it does already exist, if there is already a group working on this, we don't reinvent the wheel, but we try to join in with that group. And we try to be very open, transparent, and make sure that all members can contribute into that. Naturally, Australia doesn't exist in a vacuum, and certainly in the research data and the e-research tool space, there's a lot of developments happening internationally also. So we try to ensure that any international relevant discussions are also brought into these national discussions. We also try to be sensible that communities don't have to exist forever, and be alert to the fact that sometimes a challenge is solved, sometimes a standard is agreed, sometimes the discussion moves on, and at that point in time we do choose to close that community and move on to other communities. So that's just a few perspectives that I could quickly bring up from what we are currently doing with a series of communities. I do know that if you look at the total of the offerings of the ARDC and where we're looking, one of the spaces we find very important is skills, and making sure that there is a group of research support staff out there that have the right skills and can convey the skills to researchers. That program is currently being developed further, and we are doing a sort of a landscape study to understand what the current skills landscapes look like. So we will be organising a skills summit in the just after the e-research conference. So keep your eyes open for that event, and if you're interested in those discussions, please join in and sign up to that will again be in a series of virtual events. So I hope that was useful in giving you a bit of perspective where we're at, and where currently we are supporting a number of communities to achieve the goals. And I think hopefully these are the communities that are also relevant to your work too. So thank you very much.